Who can tell me what this is? Casey.
It's a metal.
That's right, it is a metal, but it is a very special metal, and it relates to the treaties signed by the founders of Canada. Who can tell me what a treaty is? Ray.
Treaties are promises.
You're right, treaties are promises. Now, who here is a treaty Canadian? Yes, you are, definitely. But what about the rest of us? Can you imagine what it was like for First Nations and Europeans before Canada or Saskatchewan even existed?
First Nations people lived on the lands of North America for centuries before Europeans arrived. The Europeans came from across the Atlantic Ocean in search of a better life. The First Nations people welcomed the newcomers, teaching them many things to help them survive.
My grandma, I call her Mom Indene, and she told me about new people. They didn't know how to hunt, trap, or survive in winter, so my family helped them.
The Europeans also offered to help the First Nations by establishing a fur trading company called the Hudson's Bay Company. They believed it was important to build their relationship, so they gave gifts, and everyone participated in First Nations customs, including spiritual ceremonies. After Confederation in 1867, when Canada became a country, land treaties were made in the West in order to develop the land for agriculture. The West would become the grain-producing region, specializing in the growing and export of grains to other regions, especially to Eastern Canada. The West was seen as an important part of the economy that would help make Canada a successful country. But this was not only a land deal.
At my house, we were taught that business is more than making a deal. It's about relationship and getting along.
The Europeans needed the First Nations people to help develop the land. They also needed their approval in that development to prevent war. The First Nations were looking for support from the Europeans for education, economic development, and medical treatment. Diseases like smallpox and influenza spread to First Nations communities through contact with the Europeans. As well, years of a specialized buffalo hunt meant the buffalo were disappearing. Loss of livelihood and disease were two key reasons to enter into treaty negotiations. First Nations wanted a better future, and they had a powerful bargaining tool. They agreed to share the land in exchange for protection of the land and its people. It was to be a solemn undertaking. The treaties were negotiated from two very distinct worldviews, both a product of who we are as a province today. The European settlers had a strong tradition of the written word. First Nations, an equally strong tradition of the spoken word. It is the elders who hold the sacred teachings and share them with First Nations and non-First Nations people. Elders are seen as wise and honest because they have lived many years and also learned to be good listeners.
The elders tell us that our ancestors created a relationship kind of like brothers or sisters. It was supposed to be an equal relationship and one that was respectful and caring.
Between 1874 and 1906, 5 treaties were negotiated that affect Saskatchewan. The treaties legally bind First Nations and the Government of Canada to a formal relationship. Treaty 6, the most comprehensive of the numbered treaties, was signed in 1876. It paved the way for European settlement of Saskatchewan by promising the First Nations people 3 key demands: education, reserve lands, and medicine. But even as the treaties were being negotiated, there were signs the partnership was breaking down. The Government of Canada introduced the Indian Act in 1876. It contained provisions that tried to make the First Nations people adopt the culture and belief systems of the Europeans. Residential schools were set up to teach First Nations children, even though the treaty agreement made provisions for First Nations to choose where and how their children would be educated. The residential schools focused on the culture and spirituality of the European settlers. The children were taken from their homes and families. They were forced to change the way they dressed and the way they worshipped in order to be more like the Europeans. Many First Nations leaders were sent to prison for practicing their own spirituality.
Our people have been treated differently for about 100 years.
I don't think it's been very positive either.
I think that some people have a negative impression on us because they don't understand what's happened.
I think it'd make a difference if people just try to understand.
The federal government and the First Nations people are working to change that. The treaty relationship is being renewed. Treaty land entitlement issues are being settled. The history of the treaties of Saskatchewan are finally being taught in schools and communities across the province. The treaty partners are negotiating self-government for First Nations people. All of these efforts are designed to honor the treaty relationship and to build a future that is strong, just, and proud for all Saskatchewan people.
So grade 6, how many of you now think you're part of treaty relationship? Exactly. We are all treaty Canadians. As long as the sun shines, the grasses grow, and the rivers flow, we are all part of treaty.